Thank you, Allison, for that nice introduction. I never threatened to fire you, but it's not too late. Josh, Miele, thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And thanks to all of you for coming out on not the most pleasant day in the history of Chicago. I want to start with a little bit of gee whiz, if I may, but can I first ask the audience, how many of you were familiar with Dr. Miele's work? I see one hand. Okay, so great. So it'll be new for a lot of you. I want to have a little gee whiz time here at the beginning. I'd like you to talk about just some of the things that you've been involved in inventing and designing.
Sure, yeah, and thanks. I'm glad that to have the opportunity to sort of tell you guys about it, and for those of you who already know about what I do, please bear with us. Maybe there'll be some new material in here. But basically, I'm a blind scientist. I grew up blind. I went to through school blind, and up through grad school, and now I'm a blind scientist. And so basically, what I do is I invent stuff, technology, or often systems that help blind people get better access to the information they need in order to do whatever it is they want to do. So having sort of built that experience, there's a lot of stuff that I already know pretty definitely we need better access to. So I've worked in as a scientist at a nonprofit research institute in San Francisco called the one with the huge long name that Allison just read. By the way, the longer the name is, the less important you are. So that's why it has such a long name. But so as a scientist there, I've basically been able to focus on developing technologies that I think we need better. Will give us as blind people better access to different types of information. So, in general, blind people, the type of accessibility that blind people experience is information accessibility. In the same way that if you're a wheelchair user, the type of accessibility you generally need is physical access. If you have a hearing disability, or if you're deaf, the type of accessibility that you need is access to speech communications. Usually, that's the hardest thing usually. And so for blind people, information is everywhere, and it's represented in all sorts of different ways: text, graphics, video, etc. And so those are the areas where I work. I've developed, and when I say I mean me and lots of people that are are often more skilled than I am at writing software or building hardware or designing physical objects. And so I and my team at Smith-Kettlewell have worked on developing tactile maps of cities for people to be able to print out a tactile map of any place they need to know about, and so that they can actually have a physical map that they can feel of a streetscape.
Let me cut in here just for a second, and just to clarify, you're talking about a kind of the equivalent of, I would go to Google Maps, it'll print me out a map and direction, a visual map and directions, and tell me how to get someplace. So you're talking about the equivalent where you can enter in a specific place you want to go from a specific place, and you'll get a tactile map of how to get there.
Exactly, and the thing about being, so what vision is like really good at being able to give you an instant snapshot, literally, of a lot of information and the connectivity that happens within that snapshot. So a map, a visual map, is a network, a representation of, let's just say, a street map. It's a representation of a street network where you can see the angles of the streets, you can see the lengths of the streets, you can see how they're generally laid out, whether there's a pattern to the streets. And so for blind people, we want the exact same thing, but it's much harder to get because you need to put it into a form that can be felt rather than a form that can be seen. And a form that can be felt usually means lines, raised lines that you can feel on a piece of paper, so that you can not only feel the direction that one line goes, but where all of the lines are going and how they behave as a network. And this type of information was very when I started this project, it was called the TMAP project, Tactile Map Automated Production. Basically, the problem that I was addressing was it was no problem to get like a map of the United States where you could see the outlines of the states, where there were raised lines showing the state borders and maybe some rivers and mountains and stuff. But in general, it wasn't going to help you get to the grocery store, and it wasn't going to help you be independent in your city. And so this was, when I was doing this, it was at the time when maps were just becoming ubiquitous on the internet, so that you could just go to a website and for free see a street map, if you could see, of anywhere you wanted. And I thought, well, why? Like, we have the data, let's do it. So it wasn't real, it's not rocket science. And what I did was I just took existing technologies and said, let's put these things together. Let's take geographic information databases that are building the visual maps, and let's use the internet to distribute the maps in the same way that the visual ones are being distributed, and let's make them tactile. And the only special little trick there is that you don't just take a visual, like if you want a good tactile map, you don't just take the visual one and turn it into something that you can feel. Because in tactile, in feeling things, you don't have the ability to take a closer look at something. You're already getting kind of the closest look you're going to get by touching it. So things need to be spaced nicely. The density of map features need to be carefully controlled. Labeling needs to be carefully controlled. So you need to go all the way back to the data that makes the same data that makes the visual map can make the tactile map, but you need to render it in quite a different way, in a much simpler form. You usually need to do a lot of labeling abbreviation and simplification of maps. But basically, that was one of the first projects I did when I came out of grad school. And then
let me interrupt again. Do you have any sense how many people are utilizing TMAP or related similar technologies at this point?
So that's a great question. It took a while for it to catch on. For a long time, it was just sort of me running saying, I basically built a demonstration version of it with my limited skills and my own coding skills, and I made it, and it worked, and it was great. But then I realized that if I told everybody about it, then I would be stuck doing technical support on Braille embossers for the rest of my life. People would be calling me up to help them get their printers connected to their computer. So I was.
And you'd be saying, "Did you turn it off and turn it back on?"
Exactly. So what I did was I worked with some local agencies, blindness agencies, and they basically took the service and started printing maps for their clients. And at this point, I'm no longer running it. We've rebuilt it completely from the ground up. I helped a local blindness agency in San Francisco called the San Francisco Lighthouse to basically build their own version of it, and so now they're the ones that are doing it. And while I was running it, I made probably 1,500 or a couple thousand maps for people. They've been running it for the last year or so, and have added many hundreds more. But they're now doing it as an official service, which is thrilling to me, because this is information that blind people never really had access to before, and now just through sort of this process, there's not only is the service available, but people now realize, now that they can get maps of any place they want, they realize how incredibly valuable it is.
To have that sort of resource.
To have that sort of, and just,
Let me, oh, sorry.
Well, just real quick, when you're blind, if you are planning a trip from one place in the city to another place and you've never been there before, knowing the shapes of the intersections, knowing how the streets come together, is incredibly helpful, to decide, wow, I'm not gonna, that looks like a really awful six-way intersection. I'm gonna go 3 blocks west and deal with it over there, rather than crossing, at this really complex intersection. And that it's those sorts of decisions that you can make when you have a map.
I'd like you to talk a bit about the BART station maps, because you told me this story that you could get information for visually impaired people about train schedules, where stops were located, but what you couldn't get was any information about what the hell was going on inside the station and how you got from the entrance to the station to where you needed to get on the train.
Right. So so BART is the local sort of cute little transit system in the Bay Area. It's basically a commuter rail. It gets people from the suburbs into San Francisco and back out. And it's got 43 stations, and the stations were all built. It's not like Chicago or New York. The stations were all built at essentially the same time. It was a planned transit system, and so there is a great deal of consistency within the stations, and yet, for a blind person, when you are planning a trip to a place you've never been before, or in this case, through a BART station you've never been to before, when you get off the train, there's no way of knowing, should I turn left, should I turn right to get off the platform? Once I get off the platform, which way do I need to go to get to the exit I want? There are like maybe 8 exits from the station. Which one do I want? Which one's going to put me back onto the street grid in a place that is familiar to me if I'm maybe catching a bus, maybe catching a ride, like which exit do I need to go to and how do I get there? And all of those questions were questions that people didn't have the answer to unless you would sort of either plan in a lot of time in advance so that you could get lost in the station, or if somebody gave you a good description of what the station was like, or if you just sort of asked for help. But a lot of the time there aren't people around to help you, especially if it's late at night, or if it's always sort of better to know where you're going than to need to throw yourself on the mercy of the passersby. At least that's how I feel about it. And so these BART station maps are not. These are maps of each station has a set of maps associated with it that show the platform and where the train doors are going to open, and where the stairs and escalators and elevators and benches are. And then so basically you can plan your route through the station based on where you get on and off the train, how you which way you're going to go to get out or into or out of a BART station that you've never been to before. And these maps are not just tactile maps. These actually are sort of an illustration of universal design being sort of this idea that if you design it right, the most number of people can use it. If you sort of think about who's going to be using it and how it's going to be used, you want to design it so that it benefits the maximum number of people. And so they're tactile maps with Braille labels, but they're also high contrast visual maps overprinted on top of the Braille. So a sighted person and a blind person can look at the same map together and talk about it. So a blind person who's not familiar with a station might look at this map with a sighted person and say, okay, so what's this over here? And the sighted person might look at it and say, I don't know. Let's look at the key. I don't, or basically it facilitates dialogue about the space to do that. And those maps also incorporated this audio technology that we used. We used this mainstream product called the Livescribe Smartpen, and this was a technology that I was really, I did a number of projects that incorporated the Smartpen. Basically, it lets you program the pen so that when you touch the tip of the pen to a part of the tactile graphic, the pen has a little speaker on it, and it actually tells you what you're touching, so that it can reduce the amount of labeling that you have to put on your map. And Braille takes up a lot of space, so the fewer Braille labels on your map, the more clean and readable your map will be. So you can actually load all of this annotation onto the pen, so that so that even if you can't read Braille at all, which many blind people can't, you can still find out what it is that what that feature is, maybe some information. Like, for example, if you tap the pen on on a bus stop that is in the BART parking lot or something, it'll tell you it's a bus stop, but it'll also tell you which buses stop there, which, if you put that into Braille, would take up several square inches.
When you do this work, are you inventing new technology, or are you utilizing technology that's available and putting it together in new ways?
The latter. Always the latter. It's always better to use something that's already available. It's cheaper. It's been tested in other ways. It's you can get it. I learned this. I learned that when I was a kid from Robert Heinlein. There was an inventor in this book called The Door into Summer. Anybody read The Door into Summer? All right. Well, it's an old book, but there was an inventor in there, and the inventor said it's always better to use something that's already on the market. It's cheaper, it's easier, more reliable. And I was like, wow, that's true. And so in what I do, I always try to find something that's already available, being used for something else in the mass market, in order to sort of facilitate the sort of inexpensive and simple solution of some accessibility problem.
So there's many, many more things I want to talk to you about. In particular, I want to talk about video description. But before we leave tactile maps, I wanted to ask you, some of your research, sort of regular standard scientific research, has been on finger sensitivity, how people, I read a couple of your papers that had to do with successfully navigating tactile maps using one finger versus two fingers versus three fingers. Tell me what you know about that.
So I was talking, a lot of the time science is really just the process of rigorously demonstrating what you already know to be true. Part of the problem that blindness and sort of accessibility and design suffers from, and this is a theme throughout my professional career, part of the problem is that there haven't been enough blind people actually doing the research, actually developing the products, actually doing the design. And so very often there are results in the literature, historical results in the literature, that are just clearly wrong. So one of these results was that in the 60s and 70s, a number of tactile perception researchers basically did research with using blindfolded sighted undergraduates as stand-ins for real blind people, and did perceptual experiments on them in order to draw conclusions about blindness and perception. And one of the conclusions that they drew was that it doesn't make any difference whether you use one finger or two fingers or two hands to explore a tactile object or a shape or a map. You don't get any benefit from that. And that's really clearly wrong. To any person who habitually does tactile exploration, the more fingers, the more hands you have, the more accurately you can understand, the more quickly and the more accurately you can understand what's going on on a tactile map, let's say. And so the person who actually did that research was Val Morash, who was my postdoc and an amazing researcher in her own right. She died very tragically last year, and huge loss to our profession. She would have gone and done lots of more unbelievable cool research. But what she brought to it was she was just a statistical genius. And she knew how to design incredibly rigorous, incredibly complicated experiments that made use of real-time finger tracking and very, very careful stimulus balancing. So basically, she and I put together this experiment that was just completely unassailable because we both knew. She was sighted, But we both knew that these earlier conclusions were incorrect. And so, so we just basically did the work to prove it. And in fact, it's not, you get diminishing returns. The best case is, you do get a little bit more benefit from using ring fingers and pinkies on both hands, but really in general, the first two fingers are the most beneficial, and using two hands is better than using one hand. And this is something that common sense told us already, but the literature didn't reflect it. And so part of, as a scientist, as an activist for blindness, as an inventor, it's really important to me that the literature that we sort of kick over as much of the bad research, as much of the research that we know is bad as we can. And this idea that you could do just as well with one finger as you could with many fingers is a terrible idea, because it could lead to, for example, the idea that you could effectively render a map on an iPad and explore it with one finger, when that's really hard. And unfortunately, people are trying to do it right now, but it's not nearly as good as a tactile graphic where you can use multiple fingers and multiple hands.
Well, my condolences on your colleague. I didn't know that my question was leading to that, so you have my sympathy.
That's okay.
I do want to ask you about the work you've done with audio description. This is description of what's being represented visually in a video. Could be a film, could be a television program, could be something on YouTube, may have other audio, but then adding a component that is description of the visual part. Is that, am I characterizing it right?
Yeah, yeah.
So tell me, first of all, why this is important.
As Allison acknowledged in her preliminary introduction, more and more of our communication is done visually. It used to be that print was our major form of visual communication, but as we become more and more able to, produce high quality infographics, and video becomes cheaper and easier to distribute and produce, we're doing all sorts of communication of all levels of importance using video. And so audio description, and just to sort of step back a second, audio description is sort of like the converse of captions. Everybody's familiar with captions. Captions are really obvious how they work. It's like, hey, you can't hear what's going on the audio track. We can just write it down on the screen, and you can then have access to the audio track. So description is the converse of that. If you can't see what's on the screen, it provides an audio, quote-unquote, equivalent of what's happening on the screen that gets mixed in with the existing audio track, right? So that's what description is. But description and well, let me circle back to that. But you asked why it's important.
Yeah.
And it's important because we're not just talking about access to masterpiece theater anymore. We're talking about access to training materials at work. We're talking about video that gets used in the classroom. We're talking about educational materials that teach math and physics and economics and history. We're talking about basically the kinds of communications that were once done as text are now being the first stage, or many stages are being presented as video. When you want to learn, when you want to know how to, make pretzels, you don't go to the Joy of Cooking anymore. You go to YouTube, and so access to video started as sort of this novelty, and was considered to be primarily a luxury so that blind people could have better access to entertainment. But in fact, it is no longer a luxury. It's a necessity.
So it's essentially, it's the current technology's equivalent of making textbooks available to people who can't read them visually, who can't see them. So it's that important, in other words.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, and yet it's not recognized as being as important because the sort of we have not yet caught up to the reality of how much communication, how much really basic communication is being done by video, and so.
And so you've done a project where essentially you've crowdsourced the job of getting descriptions for videos on YouTube.
Right. So this is a little bit controversial, and I want to explain that when my favorite kind of project is not a sort of an obvious solution, but a solution that is both simple and has really interesting societal and sort of cultural ramifications, something that can lead to conversations and arguments about accessibility, about blindness, about inclusion, that lead to a better understanding of what those things actually mean and how we deliver those things in an effective manner. And so this, so Udescribe, which is the project that you're talking about, Udescribe is a thing that my team and I put together. It was launched in 2013 and is still going strong. You can check it out at udescribe.org, youdescribe.org. And it is basically a YouTube player that also allows people to record audio description of any YouTube video there is. And so you can watch the video, a sighted person can watch the video and insert audio clips at any point in that video that either pause the video and let the audio clip, insert the description clip, or if you're really good, you let the video play and you insert your audio description while the video plays, which is the traditional format for audio description and definitely more desirable, but much harder to do. And by creating this tool that essentially lets anybody, anywhere, add audio description to any YouTube video and share it with everybody, we've opened up the question of what description is and who should be describing stuff. And so, because I'm not saying, we're just offering it as a technology. We're saying, go for it, check it out, use it. We're certainly offering plenty of links to best practices and training materials and sort of how-tos, but if you start digging into how to do audio description, you very quickly realize that it's super hard. And so going back to my...
Well, this is where I was going. Like,
Yeah.
How do you get people to do it well? I mean, it seemed like it would be really hard.
It is.
And you could get some pretty lousy descriptions. I mean, YouTube is not exactly 100% top quality video. So unsurprisingly, if anybody who wanted to could do a description, they won't all be great. So what sort of... Well, first of all, what would the standards be? Like, what direction would you want to push people in if you could make people do better descriptions? And how might that happen?
Right. So, I mean, in order to answer that, you need to know what good description is. And we know what good description is for blockbuster movies mostly, but although the data is based on best practice, not actual research. So we don't even really know what good description is. We think we do, but we're wrong in a lot of ways. Again, the assumptions that have gone into deciding what good description is aren't necessarily true. So the idea of sort of pushing people in a certain direction, trying to make them be better describers, I think this kind of a platform is an amazing opportunity for exactly that. So we have the ability to rate descriptions, so you can give 1 to 5 stars for description, so that when people, if you're a describer and you get 3 stars, you're like, whoa, why'd you give me 3 stars? And then you can look and you can see, it's because I stepped on the dialogue. It's because I described something, I over-described. I used too much too much pausing of the video, and so we've got these not only, sort of like when you use Lyft, if you give less than a 5-star rating, it's like, well, what was wrong, right? So we do the same thing on Udescribe. And so by looking at your feedback, you can find out how you could do it better. You can also find out how to do it better just by practicing and getting feedback from people. So,
but you also have an issue, and okay, I'll just confess. I watched a couple of the videos to see how this audio description worked. And one that I watched was a makeup tutorial. Right, I watched a makeup tutorial. And what was interesting about it is that I didn't understand a lot of the description because they were talking about all sorts of products and like brushes that I had no idea what they were talking about. And that doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad description. It could just be that there are contexts in which, there's no reason why a blind person doesn't know what all those brushes are. They certainly could. But I didn't, so none of it made any sense to me. But my point being, not that it needed to make sense to me, but a different, you have like more specialized users of video as opposed to general video, people who would know the names of things that were in the video that a general audience wouldn't know.
Right.
There's I guess what I'm saying is there's so much work to do.
So this is one of the beautiful things about Udescribe and about the whole idea, and Udescribe is just sort of a demonstration of a bunch of principles that I think need to be considered in the future of online accessible video. And one of the things is you don't have to, like, when you're doing a description, maybe one description does not fit all. And in fact, maybe maybe there need to be multiple descriptions that focus on different things. For you would need like some kind of like real beginner, like you wouldn't want to hear about all the different brush names, right? But
Well, let's not go too far.
I'm just, I don't know.
But
just,
yes, no,
but
your point
so,
taken.
So you can, using this system, create multiple descriptions. Like you can have as many descriptions as you want. So I sort of, the best way I think of explaining this is like if there's, like let's say you're watching a clip of some historical movie or some, going back to the Masterpiece Theater example, right, where you've got, the traditional professional description is like single track, one description fits everybody. But what if you're more interested in the costumes? What if you're more interested in the architecture? What if you're more interested in the furniture? And so the idea of having multiple descriptions available to you that could be tagged for content and selected for by the user is really something that we should be thinking about. And then the other thing that this brings forward is like, who are the describers and who are the voices that should be doing the descriptions? And the traditional audio description approach has been very journalistic, very a strong effort at impartiality and objectivity. And I don't, while that works for many video works, it's not the way we should be by default approaching everything. So a lot of the content, I think that we need to start thinking about different styles of description where, there's maybe there's commercial description, but then there's also something that I'm calling social description, right? Where it's like a video of your friend's wedding, right? And so it's perfectly acceptable for the describer to be like, oh my God, like Susan has a big, spot on her shirt, or whatever. And there's that type of sort of informal description is extremely appropriate for certain types of videos. We're all friends with everybody watching that video knows and loves Susan, and the fact that she's got a spot on her shirt is hilarious to everybody. And if you can see, you would notice it. And since you're the describer and you know and love Susan, it's okay for you to make fun of her, right?
We have so little time left. Our time has flown by. I can't even believe it. And we're going to turn to the audience for questions in just a minute. But there is a question that I've wanted to ask you since Allison first asked me to participate in this program. When I started thinking about technology and technological change and the theme graphic, the theme of this year's festival, and what occurred to me And I can say this, I know that you and I are approximately the same age. One of us is older, we shall not say who it is. But we're approximately the same age, so you and I have undergone the same technological revolution. I know what the baseline is for you, because it's the same as it was for me. So my experience in my lifetime of technological change has been largely visual, and I would say that's more true recently, in the sense that, I feel when I think about technology, and it's mostly when I'm upset at technology, so maybe that's why it stands out, but it's because I'm feeling bombarded. I'm feeling bombarded by images. I'm feeling bombarded by too many things on a screen. I'm tired of looking at a screen because it hurts my eyes. I'm having to think about icons and the shapes of things and what they look like, all those sorts of things. And I would like to know, as you think about the pace of technological change and the changes that have happened in your lifetime, is there a way for you to describe for us what that experience is like without the visual piece?
Well, we're all in it together. It's not, blind people don't experience vision directly, of course, but we still live in the same frickin' visual world, and it's often the experience that I and we have, I think, is largely sort of seeing how other people, seeing how sighted people have sort of evolved to accommodate just the exponential onslaught of visual material. And I think, one of the most, I feel like people are much less directly interactive with one another than we were even 10 years ago. I think it may be happening more in the Bay Area than it is in a lot of other places, but I feel like people on the street, I feel almost like we're so accustomed to seeing things and looking at things that happen on screens, in video, and not just entertainment. It used to be just entertainment that we would see on screens all the time, but now we're looking at things that look much more like our own realities or other realities that we could be part of. And I feel like, in general, people treat life more as if it were on a screen than they ever have before. And that's, it's not just visual. I mean, I feel it's really interesting. In the 80s, people were really into carrying around like these big boom boxes, and they would be like, they would have, and it was sort of like they were laying down a soundtrack for the world to kind of perceive them by, And now, like, everybody's got their earphones in, and it's like they're laying down a soundtrack for them to perceive the world by. And the difference is, I think it feels more isolating. It feels less connecting. Of course, there are, the internet, and we're able to communicate now more and, more ubiquitously than we've ever been able to before. But the incidental, serendipitous interactions that used to happen on the street or whatever, I think happen less frequently.
Well, let's take some questions. We have a few minutes. I think we have about 15 minutes. I'm not sure. Someone will tell me. Okay, right here on the end, ma'am.
Yes. And that we have mics circulating, so I'll be right there.
A lot of artificial intelligence research is geared to or focused on visual learning, and some on tactile learning for robots. Do you use artificial intelligence in anything that you do, and if so, in what direction are you going with it?
Yeah, so artificial intelligence, we don't, again, this is a term that gets thrown around a lot. I think that there are a number of areas in which artificial intelligence tools can be applied to accessibility for blind people. The way it's some ways that it's being used already are for using cameras to identify barcodes or money, or to identify colors of clothing, or to even recognize scenes and objects, although that's a little bit less, I don't see that, that's sort of more gee whiz than it is helpful. Other areas where it can be used, I think, where I'm thinking about it, is in pre-processing of texts so that they can be more naturally presented using text-to-speech. Right now, text-to-speech doesn't do a whole lot of knowledgeable, doesn't make use of the text in the same way that a human reader does. When a human reader, for example, reads a book out loud, the dialogue, even if you don't do extreme voices, dialogue gets read in a particular way that text-to-speech is unable to handle right now. But using natural language processing, I think we probably could do some really make speech comprehension when using text-to-speech much better. Of course, you can also, visual processing, computer vision and AI could also probably be used for to support navigation and wayfinding in better ways, but we don't quite have the processing power and the speed for that yet. But at some point pretty soon. Just as an example, right now, we use GPS pretty ubiquitously, blind people do, to know where we are outside. But once you go inside, it's very difficult to set up, to get accurate enough GPS information to know, for example, what room you're approaching, or whether it's the men's room or the women's room. But using AI and computer vision, I think that we will soon have the speed to do that kind of indoor navigation using cameras.
Here?
Wait for the mic,
Hang
please.
on.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Rachel. I'm really inspired by your work. I'm a visual designer and, I'm a visual artist and a graphic designer. I have a couple of questions. I'm intrigued by the tactile maps, and I'm wondering currently what materials you're using, and then your thoughts on haptic feedback in terms of kind of navigation and orientation. And then to your point about having more people with, quote, disabilities, even though I don't see it that way, practicing science, do you know of any initiatives or programs that try and get designers, with, let's say impairments or disabilities, whatever the language, to be practicing in those fields? So the pipeline, I guess, for designers.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Rachel. It's really hard that pipeline is difficult to feed, and it's because accessibility and sort of motivation of blind kids and people sort of is it's a very difficult job. As you know, education is already kind of problematic, and we don't quite all agree on how people should be educated, and education of blind kids is even even harder, and they're a combination of sort of lack of properly trained teaching staff, lack of resources, money, space, time, and frankly, sort of the biggest problem is probably low expectations of blind kids. Makes it really hard to produce blind professionals at any level. Not to say that they don't make it through; they do, but it's hard, and it's hard for the kids that are kids aren't always the most motivated, so it's a tough sell. And the other really difficult thing about that is that you don't always blind people don't always come from being blind kids. A lot of the time, blind people people acquire blindness later in adulthood. So you've already gone through your whole childhood, your whole schooling as a sighted person. All of your skills have been developed as a sighted person. And then you become blind or low vision or visually impaired at some level, and you've got first the emotional, the emotions that come along with that. Depression is a very common reaction to loss of vision, and that's totally understandable, even though, there are plenty of blind people out there living incredibly productive and wonderful and very fulfilling lives. But when you lose your vision, it's depressing. And so it's hard to get somebody, to connect somebody who's, to tell them that you've got to develop a whole new set of skills. So I'm just sort of touching on those things as sort of the difficulty of creating the pipeline. But then the other end of that, the difficulty is, so I sit here before you, a proud blind person, very accomplished. I'm a designer, I'm a scientist, I'm an engineer, I'm an activist. And sometimes I think, wow, really, should I still be, maybe I could be doing more good for more people if I got sort of out of research ostensibly and got more into industry. And so I do that. I think about that once in a while. And a couple of years ago, when I was thinking about sort of what I might do that isn't what I'm currently doing, I put together a design resume. I've got a great portfolio of things that I have designed. I come from I have the design gene. I came from a family of clothing designers and architects and visual artists and photographers and architects. Did I say architects? Yeah. So I'm a designer, and I put together a resume and I sent it to a design recruiter, and she called me back and she said, "I find it fascinating that you think you could be a designer and you're blind." And I was like, okay, okay, and so it's not just whether or not we can design, but it's the prejudices in almost every case, the preconceptions about what blindness is and what blindness allows you to do and prevents you from doing are the greatest barrier. And that's not just in the sighted world. It's also plenty of blind people are self-limiting. We think, oh, I couldn't do that. That would be too hard. That would be too much work. I could, you have to be able to see, whatever. So that's the other thing. And then finally, and I know that I'm taking too much time answering this one question, but it's a great question. The design tools, the tools that people use to design things are incredibly visual. So I would like to be able to design 3D objects. I would like to be able to use, to draw something and have it produced on my laser cutter. But the tools are not available. So that is one of the areas where I'm doing active research, is sort of how can we get better access to these design tools that are predominantly visual but don't need to be. If we can think of better ways to, in real time, interact with the digital tools that we use to do these things. So that is an optimistic part of it.
So behind Rachel, there was a question.
So have you been doing any research for elderly people as they lose their vision later in life?
So most of the tools that I develop, I intend to be usable by as wide a variety of people as possible. And so, some of what I've done has been sort of focused at younger students, like, for example, an accessible periodic table that you could touch and also use the pen with it so that you could get all sorts of additional information. Like, I don't expect, the periodic table is mostly a teaching tool, right? However, I think Udescribe is an example of something that could facilitate anybody, right? Anybody could use it. You don't have to be in school or a young adult to benefit from having access to Udescribe. The same thing with some of the outdoor wayfinding tools that I've developed. I have an iOS app called Over There that that lets you point your iPhone in any direction and hear what businesses are in that direction. It's a free app that that anybody can use, and many older folks have, I know that many older people that are losing their vision, more recently are using that. And the same thing is true of the Bart Maps. The Bart Maps, really the whole point of the Bart Maps and of maps in general is to give you more confidence about wayfinding, about independent travel. And that's one of the hardest things to do with folks that are losing their vision later in life, is to provide them with enough confidence that they have the information they need to do that thing. And so it's not that people couldn't do it without these tools, but a lot of the time these tools sort of provide the extra confidence to go out and try something. So again, the Bart Maps were designed so that you don't need to know Braille. You don't need to be able to, the idea is it has a very low bar for entry and for use. So yes, I'm thinking about blindness sort of across the lifespan.
We have time for just one more question.
Allison, we need to schedule 2 hours next time, okay? There's so much I didn't get to. You have no idea.
Relating to
It's because I
the
talk too
question-
much.
Oh, sorry. Relating to the question that was just asked regarding age, I'm also curious about technology and assistive technology that's available to the deafblind community, things that aren't as reliant on audio. And I was a little bit late, so I'm sorry if you mentioned this already, but I would love for you to expand on that.
Yeah, so I mean, so a large part of my work has to do with tactile perception and tactile maps and tactile representations of what would normally be presented visually. So a point that I often make when talking about this stuff is that we often think of these of graphics as being visual, but in general, graphics are not visual; they're spatial. They're presenting information using a spatial representation of where one thing is on the page in relation to another thing. And we're so accustomed to seeing those types of representations that we think that it's inherently visual, but it's not. It's spatial. And tactile perception is really just as good at, if not as fast as, understanding spatial representations as vision is. So most of the tactile work that I've done is really quite applicable to use by people with who are blind and also have some hearing loss or whatever. Many of the things that can be done with text-to-speech can also be rendered with something called Refreshable Braille. So Braille is, there are technologies that basically present dynamic Braille dots that can pop up and down. So it's basically a little text display that can show Braille. And so almost anything that can be presented with text-to-speech can also be presented with Refreshable Braille. But this is, again, an interesting problem because the fewer people there are that benefit from a particular technology, the less likely it is that you can get funding or that effort will be spent to address those accessibility barriers. And so where I work, what I do, we're very interested in making sure that it's not about how many people benefit. It's about the fact that there are people out there that need access to information. And so we're trying to figure out how best to do that in the most appropriate ways from a user standpoint, not from a paternalistic standpoint.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Miele, for talking with us today. It's really been a pleasure. I really do wish we had a great deal more time because there's a lot more to hear about and to learn about. And I have found preparing for this conversation and doing this conversation extremely thought-provoking. And I would suggest to those of you who might be interested in knowing more, there's videos of talks that Dr. Miele's given that you can find on YouTube or elsewhere on the web, and they're just really interesting. So I'd encourage you to go there. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for coming all the way to
Thank you.
Chicago. It's really been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.